Hello, I'm Dawn Jaglam-Bartush, and like many of the other presenters in this series, I was a member of the ELCA Task Force on Criminal Justice. I teach sociology and criminology at Valparaiso University in Indiana. In my criminal justice system course, I take students on field trips to prisons, which is always eye-opening for them. I also co-teach a class in one of those prisons. My colleague and I bring together students from Valparaiso University and students who are incarcerated. They participate together in a dialogue-based class that is part of the Inside Out Prison Exchange program. A goal of the program is to achieve social change through transformative education. This program recognizes that prison walls do not exist only to keep some people in, they also exist to keep others out. Our class is an effort to tear down the walls that divide and to dismantle stereotypes. I am convinced that my students will carry out their vocations in the world, especially in the criminal justice system, differently and with greater compassion because of the connections they are able to make in this class. To me, this is not just a class, it's also part of my ministry. In session 4, you talked about the ministries of hospitality and accompaniment as ways that we can show God's love. Today, I want to talk to you about advocacy as a strategy to improve the criminal justice system and about what the social statement recommends will improve it. First of all, though, who is an advocate? An advocate is someone who speaks with and for others who are marginalized. For example, victims of crime often feel unable to express their concerns and needs. Those who are incarcerated feel cut off from communicating with others. The people with the least political and economic power are the most likely to be harmed by the criminal justice system. Therefore, they need advocates. Are Christians really called to be advocates? Yes, we are. For example, the social statement urges us to organize efforts that reorient the present criminal justice system away from retribution alone and toward preparing individuals for re-entry into our communities. Okay, so our advocacy is needed, but how do we muster up the courage to be advocates for God's people crying out? First of all, we can remember we're not in this alone. In John 14, as Jesus is speaking to his disciples, he says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever." Jesus promised that the advocate would be God's gift to us. The same Spirit who notices and cares about our lives moves among us and strengthens us to speak up. The Spirit combines the modicum of courage and love for others in each of us and adds all that up to be enough to advocate with and for those crying out against injustice. We can be sure the Holy Spirit as advocate doesn't stop when we fail, but keeps on working to change what seems impossible to change. Truth teller, abider, teacher, these are all words from the Bible that describe our advocate, the Holy Spirit. They describe what we are to do as advocates for God's people. Speak truth, stay in there, and teach. It's not only God's Holy Spirit that urges us on to be advocates. The ELCA social statement specifically urges the kinds of changes needed. The recommendations there are based on data and evidence about what works and what doesn't. I'd like to tell you what I see and do as someone who studies and teaches about the criminal justice system. I encourage my students to appreciate what is right and good in our criminal justice system. For example, the protection of individuals' due process rights that is at the foundation of our system. But I also encourage them to consider the many areas of brokenness and how they might work through their vocations in the criminal justice system and as good citizens to address these areas. You may remember these areas from previous sessions. The United States spends more than $60 billion annually on corrections and has the highest incarceration rate in the world. So what does the social statement call for in terms of our advocacy to begin to address these areas of brokenness? The statement supports positive trends for reform, such as greater emphasis on victims' rights and needs, use of restorative justice, community-based alternatives to incarceration, legislation that reduces sentences for certain offenses, the emergence of specialized courts, and it calls for more resources for reentry programs. You might say that mass incarceration is the biggest problem of all because it causes so much harm, both personal and social. Appropriately, the statement calls for significant reduction. There are 3 specific recommendations: pursue alternatives to incarceration, reform sentencing laws and policies, and closely scrutinize national drug policy. The statement calls for reform of the sentencing policies adopted since the 1980s. These policies led to increased incarceration, but have not proven to be effective in deterring crime. They also lack transparency and impose huge costs on offenders, families, and neighborhoods. The statement doesn't stop there. It also says the criminal justice system needs 3 big changes. 1, it must address implicit and explicit racism. 2, it must change the way we deal with juvenile offenders. And 3, it must foster the full reintegration of ex-offenders into the community. I know this is a lot to wrap your mind around. Don't worry, all of these ideas are spelled out in more detail in the social statement, which is always available online. What's important is to pick one of these key areas, learn more about it, and become an advocate. As we wrap up this last session, I want to thank you for participating in this study of the ELCA social statement, the church and criminal justice, hearing the cries. And I pray for your ministry. All of us who researched and crafted the statement know this topic has not been an easy one to face. The ELCA voting members who adopted it at the 2013 Churchwide Assembly knew their action was only a renewed beginning for our church. Together we have a long way to go, but the words from Micah assure us we are called to get involved. Micah writes, "But what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." As after each presentation, now you will have a chance to talk with others in your group. You can think about how this study has inspired you and called you to action together. God bless your discussions now and your actions in the years to come.